In the fall of 1864, the maritime colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, had planned to meet to discuss a union. However, a delegation of 12 cabinet ministers from the province of Canada, led by John A. Macdonald, with the approval of the British, also arrived in Charlottetown that September. It was here that Macdonald outlined a proposal for a federal union with a strong central government. While the formal sessions outlined constitutional and economic points, the real persuasion happened at the nightly parties as the Canadians had stocked their steamer with numerous cases of champagne. At Charlottetown, the Maritime Union died, and the beginnings of a federal union were born. The discussions were to continue in more depth the following month in Quebec. The Quebec Conference, in October 1864, that lasted for 3 weeks, was where the details of the federal union were decided. Edward Whalen, a newspaperman for the Examiner, a member of the Prince Edward Island Assembly, and a delegate to the conference who supported the federal union, wrote for his readers an explanation of the proposal that, quote, "It appears to have been suggested that each of the provinces should have a local legislature and executive charged with the control of all local matters, and that in a general legislature and executive should be vested the control of affairs common to the whole country. It seems to have been held as indisputable that the functions of the general and local governments, and the subjects delegated to each, must be clearly defined in the Constitution so as to prevent collision and give security for local interests. The whole to be embodied in an act of the Imperial Parliament. In regard to the constitution of the general or federal legislature, the representation in the lower house must be based on population, and that of the upper house on sectional equality." End quote. Thus, the new union would have 2 levels of government, a central or federal one to govern the whole of what would be known as the Dominion of Canada, and the provincial governments to handle local affairs. The federal government's assembly, the House of Commons, would be elected as George Brown wanted, through representation by population, and the Senate would be appointed based on regional population levels. Some of the most important work at the Quebec Conference were the decisions about what would be the federal and provincial areas of jurisdiction. Macdonald felt that the federal government should have broad and imposing powers. He held that a weak central government was to blame for the American Civil War and did not want to repeat that mistake. Among the many powers of the federal government that were proposed were like trade, taxation, money, banking, the military and naval service, immigration, railways, post office, patents, and weights and measures. Perhaps the most important was that all matters not specially and exclusively reserved for the local governments and legislatures. This meant that the federal government would have far-ranging power. Added to this residual power clause was that the federal government would have the power to disallow provincial laws. Therefore, the delegates clearly intended that the federal government should have strong powers and would act for the interests of the whole Dominion. Provincial governments were to have powers over local affairs, but what would these be? For Lower Canada, it was important to protect the educational and social services that were being provided by the Catholic Church, as well as to ensure that the civil law system would remain in place. As a result, the provinces would be granted responsibilities over areas like education, healthcare, welfare, the courts, policing, property, contracts, and the regulation of businesses. At the conference, one of the sticking points was minority education rights. Education in the 19th century was provided along religious lines. Schools were either Catholic or Protestant. Thomas D'Arcy McGee, an Irish Catholic delegate from Montreal, was concerned that majorities could impose their religion on minorities through the school system. He negotiated a guarantee in the new Constitution for English-language Protestant education in Lower Canada and French-language Catholic education in Upper Canada. When the conference was over, there were 72 resolutions that would form the basis of the new Constitution. It was only the legislatures that could approve the resolutions, and this constitution before it was to be sent to the Imperial Parliament in London. The members of the conference were only delegates who would advise their governments. Wayland was alone amongst the Prince Edward Island delegates who supported the federal union, while others feared they would be outnumbered by the larger provinces, and the island ultimately chose not to move forward. They would not be the only skeptics. The Rouge in Lower Canada were openly hostile because they feared losing their French-Canadian culture and language, while others in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were also suspicious of the proposal. It was now time to sell the agreement to the people so the British could make it official.